Good morning. So now you should have had your bread sitting out all night, rising nicely. And what we're going to do to finish this up is turn the bread dough out onto a floured surface. And then we're going to knead it for a little while and get some of the air bubbles out. Then we'll divide it in two and put it in our baking dishes. And then we will cover those and set them out to rise again. All right, the camera cut off on us, but we've been kneading our bread dough, and you just want to make sure that you get as many of the air bubbles out as you can. It doesn't require as much flour this time, and you'll feel the air bubbles pop under your hands, and you can hear them pop when you first dump the bread dough out. It's got lots of bubbles in it. So, depending on what size bread pan you have, the original recipe says that it will make 3 loaves. I felt like 3 loaves were a bit too small each loaf, and so I've gone down to just making 2. So I just kind of knead it out until it's in a little log, and then I cut it in half. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just guess. Okay, then I usually ball them up. Just try to make sure that they're both approximately the same size. These look okay. So I set that one aside, and then I knead each of them individually just a little bit. Again, just to finish working out the rest of those air bubbles. Okay. Sorry.
Fell over. I'm just gonna have to hold it, Mom, because
Okay. So then I roll it up. I make a little loaf out of it. I have 2 glass bread pans that I have sprayed on the inside with some non-stick spray. So I flip this over, touch it to the bottom, and then put it in the top. So that way it's got a little bit of the non-stick on top of it. And then I need the second one. You can still hear the air bubbles popping, which they will continue to pop. Okay. Roll this one out too. I like to tuck the ends in a little bit. There's loaf number 2. Put it in there. Okay. Then I take the loaves and I just mash them in so that they're spread out and all the way down into the pan. I do the same over here with the first one. I always end up with one loaf that's a little bit larger and one that's a little smaller. Now, the last step for right now is to once again cover them and set them out of the way. This recipe calls for 2 separate risings, so I just put those there. They're nice and covered. Again, they're not in a cold spot or a hot spot, no drafts. Our magic numbers, 8 to 12. These are going to sit 8 to 12 hours, depending on how warm or cool it is in your house, and depending on the amount of humidity. They may rise faster or slower, and so sometimes I bake after 6 or 7 hours. Sometimes I don't bake for 10 or 12 or 13 hours. Again, very forgiving. This recipe is super flexible. I just usually keep an eye on the pans, and when they look like they have risen sufficiently is when I bake. Right now it is 9:30, so I expect to be baking this afternoon around probably 2 o'clock, maybe 3. I've got to be gone this afternoon from about 3 to 4:30 or 5, so I don't want to wait too long. Sometimes if I forget about them sitting here, or if I have to be out somewhere and I'm not able to get back in time, they'll just keep on rising. And so sometimes if I forget, they rise way up and then they start spilling out of the pan. And if that happens, I just usually pick up the pieces that have spilled out and I just fold them back in on the bread itself. It still tastes fine. It's not very pretty, but there's nothing wrong with the way it tastes. That's what happened to this loaf. It spilled out, so what you end up with is kind of ugly from where I folded it in, and the top crust here is a little crustier than what it normally would be, but it still tastes just fine. It baked normally, so you're not going to mess the bread up, basically. And then when I have to bake it a little bit early, I just end up with smaller loaves. They just don't rise as tall if I have to bake early. So it's very flexible. So we'll let these sit here, and then I'll be back later today when it's time to bake. Here we are this afternoon. It's about 20 till 2, so I was just a little bit off, but I'm going to go ahead and bake. These look lovely. Nice and tall. They've filled all the pan. Got a nice round top to them. These could go a little longer, or they could have baked, a few minutes ago too. You can see here, you kind of got a little bulge on the side, like it might try to fall over, but it shouldn't. So this is overlapped a little bit right here, but otherwise they look great. They will go in the oven on 350 degrees, and they bake anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes, depending on what kind of crust you like. So the shortest I usually bake is 35, and the longest I usually bake is 40 minutes. Just depends on how the bread looks. The nice thing about the glass pans is I can kind of check on them, and I can see on the side here whether I feel like the crust is done enough. I have had a couple of loaves not bake long enough, and so they ended up still kind of doughy on the inside in the very middle. And of course I've baked loaves a little bit too long, but then the crust is darker and crunchier. It's just a harder crust, but the inside of the bread still tastes just fine. So I've got my oven set. I'm waiting for it to preheat. In my oven, I tend to, I have to have plenty of space for the loaves. So I have the bottom rack set on the second setting, and then I have to put the top rack all the way at the top, because you want the bread to kind of be somewhat towards the middle of your oven. You don't want it too hot up towards the broiler element, and you don't want it too low sitting right on top of the bottom elements. So these will go in. I'll set the timer for 35 minutes. That's in my oven. That's kind of the special number. Sometimes if I'm in a hurry, I pull them out a few minutes prior to that. And then sometimes if they don't look completely done, I leave them in for another 5 minutes. But on mine, generally it's 35 minutes. When they come out of the oven, you want to leave them, I got a gnat. You want to leave them on the oven in the pans for about 10 to 15 minutes. The bread will kind of finish baking on the inside while it's sitting out. So 10 to 15 minutes, let them sit on the stovetop. And then at the end of that, you want to dump them out onto a wire or some type of cooling rack and let them cool the rest of the way. I find that the bread is easier to slice after it's been baked and then frozen. So I don't usually slice fresh bread, even if I just let it freeze overnight and pull it out the next day. I don't ever slice it frozen. You want to make sure it completely thaws first. But for whatever reason, I have found that the bread slices easier after it's been frozen and thawed. Sometimes everybody's really eager to have some nice warm bread fresh out of the oven, and that's okay too. I usually end up having some tears and a few mushed pieces because it's just too soft right out of the oven. So I let mine cool completely on the wire rack, and then I wrap them in tin foil and I put them in the freezer. And then as I need them, I just pull them out. Usually I'll set a loaf out right before bed, and then by morning it's ready to slice and enjoy. So here's our bread, and it's about to go in the oven. And I won't be here when they come out, so I'm gonna have my son finish baking for me, and he'll put them on the cooling rack. So hopefully you've enjoyed this, and you've now got 2 loaves of delicious looking bread ready to go in the oven. And oh, there's my timer.